What is coming will not announce itself with fire and thunder. It will not begin with a formal declaration of war. It will not begin with a general standing behind a podium, pointing to a map, explaining to the public that the line has finally been crossed. It will not begin as a clean strategic decision made in calm rooms by careful men with perfect information. It may begin with something much smaller. One drone, one missile, one explosion near a base, one American body bag, one moment that neither Washington nor Tehran can walk back from once it happens, and that is why this ceasefire is far more dangerous than it appears. Because Trump's ceasefire with Iran does not rest on trust. It does not rest on reconciliation. It does not rest on a solved strategic problem. It rests on one red line: American deaths, and Tehran knows it. Pay close attention to what follows, because the real question is not whether Iran can defeat the United States in a conventional war. It cannot. That is the wrong question, asked by people who still imagine power only in terms of aircraft carriers, bombers, missiles, and bases. The real question is much colder. Can Iran create enough pressure around American forces, Gulf bases, oil markets, Israeli calculations, and Washington's political divisions that the ceasefire becomes impossible for Trump to manage? Because if the answer is yes, then Iran does not need to defeat America. It only needs to split Washington. This is not theater. This is mathematics. A superpower does not collapse because one missile lands. A superpower begins to fracture when the cost of every next move becomes politically unbearable, and that is the battlefield Iran is studying now. Not only the Gulf, not only Iraq, not only Syria, not only Israel, not only the Strait of Hormuz. The deeper battlefield is Washington itself. The battlefield is Congress asking who authorized the war. The battlefield is the White House trying to look strong without being dragged into a conflict it cannot easily end. The battlefield is the Pentagon calculating force protection while politicians calculate polling numbers. The battlefield is American families asking why their sons and daughters are sitting inside bases across the Middle East, waiting for a retaliation that Washington insists is under control. And the battlefield is Trump's own red line. Because once a leader publicly ties escalation to a specific trigger, that trigger becomes more than a warning. It becomes a target in the mind of every adversary. Not necessarily a target to strike directly, but a target to pressure. A target to approach, a target to surround with ambiguity, a target to turn into a political trap. That is what Iran understands. Iran does not need to launch a massive attack on America. It does not need to sink an aircraft carrier. It does not need to destroy a major US base. It does not need to win a battlefield victory that would be almost impossible against American conventional power. Iran only needs to make the ceasefire feel temporary. It needs to make every American base in the region feel exposed. It needs to make every drone alarm feel like the beginning of something larger. It needs to make every intercepted missile raise the same question inside Washington. What happens if the next one gets through? That is the danger, because the ceasefire is not a wall. It is a glass floor. Everyone is standing on it. Everyone can see the drop beneath it, and everyone knows exactly what kind of crack would make the entire structure fail. Now understand the mainstream mistake. The mainstream asks, will Trump attack Iran again? That is the wrong question. The deeper question is, can Trump avoid attacking Iran if an American is killed? That is a very different problem. Because strategy is not only what a leader wants to do, strategy is what a leader can still avoid doing after the political conditions have changed. Before an American death, Trump has room. He can negotiate. He can threaten. He can claim strength. He can say Iran understands the consequences. He can speak about peace through power. He can present the ceasefire as proof that his pressure worked. But after an American death, the room becomes smaller. Every opponent will call him weak. Every hawk will demand retaliation. Every ally will question American credibility. Every media network will replay the footage. Every grieving family becomes part of the strategic equation. Every advisor enters the room with a different calculation. And suddenly the question is no longer, what is the best strategic move? The question becomes, what move can the president survive politically? That is when ceasefires die. Not always because leaders want war, but because the politics of restraint becomes harder than the politics of escalation. Iran has studied this. Iran has lived under American pressure for decades. Iran understands that the United States is militarily powerful, but politically impatient. It understands that America can destroy targets quickly, but struggles to sustain a clear political consensus once the conflict becomes costly, ambiguous, and open-ended. Vietnam taught that lesson, Iraq taught that lesson, Afghanistan taught that lesson. Every long American conflict taught the same lesson in a different language. The United States can win battles and still lose the patience required to convert those battles into political victory. Iran's strategy is built around that fact, not because Iran is stronger than America, but because Iran knows it does not need to be stronger everywhere. It only needs to be patient in the places where America is divided. This is the hidden arithmetic of the ceasefire. Phase 1 is pressure without ownership. This is the most important phase, and it is the one most viewers misunderstand. Iran does not need to openly declare every action. It does not need to stamp its signature on every incident. It does not need to make every proxy, militia, drone, or missile part of a single official campaign. In fact, ambiguity is part of the weapon. A drone approaches a base, a cargo ship linked to US or Israeli interests is struck, a militia issues a statement, a missile is intercepted near a Gulf facility, a base raises alert levels. A US commander confirms defensive action, but avoids saying the ceasefire is dead. Each incident is small enough to avoid immediate all-out war, but together they create a new atmosphere. An atmosphere where peace exists only on paper. An atmosphere where American forces remain under constant threat. An atmosphere where Trump must keep explaining why the ceasefire is still holding, even as the region behaves as if it is already breaking. That is pressure without ownership. And it is extremely difficult to answer. If America responds too strongly, Iran says Washington destroyed the ceasefire. If America responds too weakly, critics say Trump abandoned deterrence. If America blames Iran directly, Tehran demands proof. If America blames proxies, Tehran denies control. If America strikes the proxies, the network spreads. If America strikes Iran directly, the war returns. This is why ambiguity is not confusion. Ambiguity is strategy. It allows Iran to test the red line without necessarily crossing it in a way that forces immediate retaliation. The red line is American death, so Iran's problem is not how to cross it. Iran's problem is how close it can move to it without triggering the exact response it does not yet want. That is a very dangerous game, but it is a game Tehran has played before. Phase 2 is force protection pressure. This is where the military problem becomes political. The United States has forces spread across the region: Gulf bases, naval assets, air defense systems, logistics hubs, command facilities, contractors, intelligence sites, and support networks that allow American power to operate across the Middle East. On paper, this is strength. But in a crisis, every forward position is also a liability. Every base must be protected. Every convoy must be watched. Every aircraft must be secured. Every radar must remain alert. Every soldier becomes both a military asset and a political risk. Iran understands this. A single American casualty can do what 100 intercepted drones cannot do. It can change the conversation in Washington. That is the asymmetry. America measures power in platforms. Iran measures pressure in thresholds. America asks how many missiles were intercepted. Iran asks how many nights American commanders can keep their forces on alert before the political system begins to ask why they are there. America asks whether its bases are defended. Iran asks whether those bases have become hostages to the president's own red line. A modern military does not run on courage. It runs on logistics, alert cycles, personnel rotations, maintenance, intelligence, morale, political permission, and the assumption that the mission still makes strategic sense. If that assumption weakens, the military machine does not collapse immediately, but the political machine around it begins to strain. And Iran's strategy is not to defeat the American military in a direct contest. Iran's strategy may be to make the American military presence politically expensive enough that Washington starts fighting with itself. That is why this ceasefire is so fragile. It is not only being tested by Iran, it is being tested by the geography of America's own commitments. Phase 3 is the Washington split. This is the phase Tehran wants. Not because Iran controls Washington, it does not, but because Iran understands that pressure creates arguments, and arguments inside a superpower can become more useful than victories on a battlefield. One side says Trump must strike back. Another side says Trump has no authority. One side says Iran only understands force. Another side says another Middle East war would be political suicide. One side says protect Israel at any cost. Another side asks why American troops should die for a crisis that keeps expanding. One side says the ceasefire is weakness. Another side says escalation is the trap. This is where Iran's leverage grows, because every American debate becomes part of Tehran's calculation. If Congress challenges Trump's war powers, Iran sees hesitation. If Trump threatens annihilation but avoids escalation, Iran sees political constraint. If the Pentagon moves assets defensively, Iran sees vulnerability. If allies disagree privately, Iran sees coalition fatigue. If oil markets panic, Iran sees economic pressure on the West. If the public grows tired of another Middle East crisis, Iran sees time working in its favor. This is the war beneath the war. Not missiles against missiles, not ships against ships, but pressure against political cohesion. And this is where the United States is most vulnerable. Not because America is weak. America is not weak. It is vulnerable because its power requires consensus. A democracy can fight, but it must explain why. It can escalate, but it must justify the cost. It can punish enemies, but it must survive the domestic consequences. It can project strength abroad, but it cannot ignore division at home. Iran knows this. And Tehran does not need every American to oppose the war. It only needs enough Americans to doubt the next step, enough lawmakers to challenge authority, enough commentators to question the mission, enough military families to demand answers, enough markets to fear escalation, enough allies to hesitate, enough uncertainty to make Trump's red line feel less like strength and more like a trap. Now let us address the obvious objection. Would Iran really risk killing Americans? This is the wrong way to frame the issue. The question is not whether Iran wants a direct war with the United States. Rational actors rarely desire uncontrolled war with a stronger military power. The real question is whether the system of pressure Iran has built can produce exactly the kind of incident that neither side fully controls. A militia miscalculates, a drone is not intercepted, a missile lands closer than expected, a commander interprets orders aggressively, a radar mistake creates panic, a ship captain makes the wrong move, a local actor believes escalation serves its own interests. This is how wars expand, not always because capitals choose catastrophe, but because the machinery of pressure begins producing events faster than diplomacy can contain them. That is the danger of Trump's red line. It is clear enough to be understood, but fragile enough to be tested by accident, proxies, miscalculation, and political theater. A red line can deter, but it can also invite probing, because every adversary wants to know whether the red line is real, where exactly it begins, and how much pressure can be applied around it without triggering full retaliation. This is the nightmare scenario for Washington. Not a clean Iranian attack that produces a clean American response, but a gray zone incident, something deniable, something messy, something where Americans are hurt, but responsibility is disputed. Something where Trump must respond, but every response carries risk. Strike Iran and the ceasefire is over. Do nothing and deterrence looks broken. Strike proxies and the proxies multiply. Escalate at sea and oil markets panic. Move troops out and critics call it retreat. Keep troops in and the next casualty becomes more likely. That is not a strategy space. That is a cage. And Iran's entire objective may be to make the cage visible. This is why the Gulf matters. The Gulf is not just water. It is a pressure chamber. American bases sit near Iranian reach. Oil routes sit near Iranian pressure. Gulf monarchies sit between American protection and Iranian retaliation. Israel sits inside the broader escalation chain. Global markets sit on top of energy fears. And Trump sits on top of a political system that rewards strength but punishes prolonged chaos. Iran does not need to control the entire Gulf. It only needs to make the Gulf feel uncontrollable. That is a different kind of power. A weaker state can use geography to make a stronger state pay attention. A weaker state can use proxies to multiply uncertainty. A weaker state can use restraint to appear rational and escalation to appear dangerous. A weaker state can use the enemy's red line as a measuring instrument, and that is what may be happening now. Iran is not necessarily preparing for one decisive strike. It may be preparing a pressure environment, a space where every day of ceasefire becomes harder to defend. Every incident becomes a test. Every test becomes a headline. Every headline becomes a political argument. Every political argument weakens Washington's ability to speak with one voice. That is the point. Because America's greatest weapon is not only its military, it is the belief that when America decides, America can act. Iran's goal is to make that belief questionable, not by defeating the US Navy, not by destroying American air power, but by turning every American option into a domestic argument. This is how pressure becomes strategy. Now think historically. Great powers often misunderstand smaller adversaries because they measure them by the wrong standard. They ask, can this adversary defeat us? But the adversary is asking a different question. Can we exhaust them? Can we divide them? Can we make victory too expensive? Can we make the next step politically toxic? Can we make their allies nervous? Can we make their public uncertain? Can we make their leaders choose between looking weak and walking into a trap? That is the logic Iran is using. It is not new. It is old. Ancient states used it against empires. Insurgencies used it against occupations. Regional powers used it against global powers. The method changes. The principle remains the same. Do not strike the empire where it is strongest. Strike it where power must become permission. And in America, power becomes permission inside Washington. That is why Congress matters. That is why public opinion matters. That is why Trump's words matter. That is why one American death matters. Because one casualty can turn an external crisis into an internal crisis. One casualty can transform pressure on Iran into who authorized this war? One casualty can make every previous warning look insufficient. One casualty can force a president to choose between restraint and retaliation under the harshest possible spotlight, and Tehran knows it. Now, to be clear, capability is not inevitability. Iran may choose restraint. The ceasefire may hold. Diplomats may find a temporary formula. Gulf states may pressure both sides to step back. Washington may avoid the trap. Tehran may decide that testing the red line too aggressively creates more danger than advantage. But capabilities that exist do not disappear. Pressure networks that have been built do not vanish. Proxy forces do not stop mattering because diplomats meet. Bases do not stop being vulnerable because leaders use the word ceasefire, and political divisions do not disappear because a president wants to project strength. They remain there, waiting for the incident, waiting for the miscalculation, waiting for the moment when one red line becomes the center of the entire crisis. This is the uncomfortable truth. Trump's red line may be designed to deter Iran, but it also tells Iran exactly where American politics becomes most fragile. That is the paradox. A red line is supposed to show strength, but if the adversary believes it can control the pressure around that line better than you can control your response, the red line becomes a weapon pointed back at you. And that is why this ceasefire is so dangerous. It is not peace, it is a pause with a trigger inside it. The world is watching the Gulf, but Tehran may be watching Washington. The world is asking whether Iran will attack America. But Iran may be asking whether America can survive the politics of being attacked. The world is counting missiles, but the real number may be one. One casualty, one base incident, one miscalculation, one night where the ceasefire becomes impossible to defend. And if that moment comes, the shock will not be that the ceasefire collapsed. The shock will be that the collapse was built into the red line from the beginning. Because once American deaths become the trigger, every American position in the region becomes part of the trigger mechanism. Every base, every ship, every patrol, every contractor, every convoy, every air defense battery, every soldier standing inside the geography of a crisis that neither side fully controls. That is not stability. That is exposure, and Iran knows it. So the real question is not whether Trump's ceasefire can survive another speech. The real question is whether it can survive the next incident. What do you think? Is Trump's red line keeping Iran contained, or has it given Tehran the exact pressure point it needs to split Washington from the inside? Tell me in the comments, because this is not only about Iran. It is not only about Trump. It is not only about one ceasefire. It is about whether America still controls escalation, or whether its enemies have learned how to make escalation control America.